Yeah, welcome to the Common Good Podcast, Thursday, July 22nd. And so excited about today. You know, on Thursdays, we talk about issues that matter to us in this world and how we can pursue those issues for the common good. Talking to Frank Schaeffer today about love, children, the planet. I mean, the kind of things that matter. And just any conversation with Frank, obviously, is a great day. So thanks for being along today. I'm in Minneapolis, sitting down. Producer Dan in the background today, over there in Indiana. And Frank, where do you find yourself today? We love to tell the good
people. I'm sitting in Massachusetts, about 35 miles north of Boston, up on the North Shore.
Up on the North Shore. I mean, that I got to tell you, Frank, just partly because being a kid in Minnesota, and I would hear about Massachusetts and hear about that place is just, it's like magical in my mind. It's the place, like, who gets to go there? Like when people say Kennebunkport, Maine, and these kinds of places up there, it's is it as magical as my little sheltered apartment complex mind of a 9-year-old made it out to be?
Yeah, more or less. And of course, you'll appreciate this, being that you live in the area where snow counts. It all depends on the weather. On a day like this, it is very magical. On some February morning when the sun doesn't come up ever and it's snow and ice, you know how that goes. It's a little less magical, but I must say I do love the North Shore Boston area.
Yeah. Hey, for those who are just listening on the podcast, they don't have the joy of seeing the artwork behind you. You have the cover to your book on a poster, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there's some other artwork behind you, and for people watching on the live streams, tell us about that artwork. The one immediately behind your head is really stunning.
Yeah, well, if I move a little bit here, and let's see, that way you can see it. There's a couple of Pinocchios falling out of the sky with a few little rubber ducks accompanying them, and some cyclamen flowers coming down, and some knives and cutlery. And basically, I painted this series when Donald Trump was happening and in the White House, and I painted a whole series of Pinocchios without too much of a stretch, really, to think about the whole lying thing we were into. But of course, I used Pinocchios that were from my own childhood, that my parents brought me from Milano, Italy, when they used to teach Bible studies there back in the 1950s, when I was a small child growing up at L'Abri Fellowship in Switzerland, an evangelical ministry. And then other paintings feature the Pinocchios along with a teddy bear or two. So it's sort of a nostalgic use of childhood toys, and at the same time giving them modern titles. People can go to my frankschaefferart.com and look at the paintings, better reproductions there, in the sense of you can see them better, and you'll see the titles that tie into the artwork and so forth and so on. But I started out painting long before I did any writing or filmmaking, and had that not been derailed by me becoming Francis Schaeffer's nepotistic sidekick out on the road in the 70s and early 80s, I would have, as they say, I could have been a contender. And I paint now for pleasure and put a few things online, but essentially it's just for me, and something that expresses what I've been thinking about, but also just the joy of actually creating the paintings.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, describing Frank Schaeffer to people, some would say, well, he's an artist. Some would say you're a provocateur. Some would say you're a theological and religious gadfly. Some would say you're a writer. Your daughter would say you're ba or grandpa.
Right.
You're kind of all of those things. And what's amazed me about you, Frank, frankly, is that you've been willing to let all those fronts sort of be out. Like, some people think you're going to pick one avenue or the other. Right. You've said, hey, I'll be a religious and political activist in the 70s that helped start the religious right, and I'll be a painter now in response to all that. So for people that don't know, and I know a lot of people who are going to listen to this already know who Frank Schaeffer is, but can you give us a little bit of your background in the about section of your new book that's coming out, which is Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, and Be Happy, which we'll talk about in a bit. In the about the author section, I like this bit where it says, Frank is a survivor of both polio and evangelical fundamentalist childhood, which is probably a Frank Schaeffer line that you wrote. All right, so give people a little quick tour of all the things that made up the person that they're going to hear in this conversation today.
Sure. Well, let me start by working backwards a little bit. I'm going to clock in at age 69 in August when I have my birthday. My wife Jeannie, who has been with me as a partner and companion and best friend and wife and lover and mother and all the rest of those things since we met when we were 17 and 18, just turned 70. And I told her on her birthday that I hadn't given her permission to turn 70, and that back in the good old days when I believed in the patriarchy and men were in charge, I never would have let her do something like that. But she went ahead and did it anyway. So we're both getting up there, Jeannie and me. I have, working back a little further, I have 3 grown children. I have 5 grandchildren. 2 of them are much older because, like Jeannie and me, who got pregnant when we were teens, my daughter married quite young and had her kids before she launched her career. And so her oldest kids, Amanda and Ben, are the age of many of my friends' kids. And then I have 3 little ones, Lucy 12, Jack 10, Nora 7, and they literally live across the street in our neighborhood. And they are the children of Becky and John. And John is my son who went straight into the Marine Corps after high school, was deployed to Afghanistan twice, once to Iraq, got out, went to the University of Chicago, graduated, got married, came home, had children. And the last 12 years of my life, working back a little further, have been as a full-time caregiver to those 3 little ones. And I mean literally me, along with Jeannie, but going not into semi-retirement, but changing my lifestyle. So, for instance, before that, I was writing more books, and this new book I've got, Fall in Love, has been taking a 5-year period, a 6-year period of research, folds a lot of that experience of being a caregiver to grandchildren into it. So then, if you roll back beyond that, Frank Schaeffer as a nanny, you'll find that.
I mean, that, I gotta say, Frank, that is just the makings of a great sitcom right there.
Right, Frank Schaeffer nanny.
It's Everybody Loves Raymond mixed with, I don't know,
Right.
some reality TV show that really
That's
somebody
it.
should pitch. Yeah.
Yeah, so Frank Schaeffer nanny would be the sitcom, and then you want to go back to Frank Schaeffer right-wing activist. You'll find me in my late teens, weirdly becoming the nepotistic sidekick to Francis Schaeffer, who at that time was at the height of being famous within the evangelical community. So mom and dad moved to Europe in 1947. They started a ministry called Le Brief Fellowship in 1954 when I was 2 years old. I got polio when I was 2. Speaking of anti-vax people, I have a personal feeling about that because I didn't get the vaccine, and I might have been able to if my parents hadn't jumped on an ocean liner to go to Europe to start this ministry that they were doing. Dad first went over after the Second World War to work with young people in bombed out cities. He chose Switzerland because, as a neutral country in the war, its railroad system and public transport still worked. It hadn't been bombed to smithereens. He could therefore go from there to Milan, to Hamburg, to London, to Amsterdam, wherever it might be. So I grew up in Switzerland as the parents of very obscure, unknown, impoverished missionaries. Literally, we probably had meat maybe once a week, a small chicken divided between our family and whatever guests were staying. That ministry gradually grew. My dad wrote a couple bestsellers back in the late 70s and late 60s, early 70s. How Should We Then Live? Later was a big bestseller in the US. Before that, it was books like Escape from Reason, The God Who Is There, and so on. Gradually, what happened was Dad became known as an intellectual voice within the religious evangelical American community. And he was someone that a lot of young people related to because he was interested in art. He was interested in literature. He was interested in music. He gave lectures on Bob Dylan, all this kind of stuff. So if you had checked into my life as a teenager in, say, age 14, 15, you would have thought that I was living in a slightly left-wing, very progressive, although evangelical community. And then later, partly driven by my ambition to make some documentary films, partly driven by the fact that his good personal friend going way back into his years in the US was Dr. C. Everett Koop, who at that time was Surgeon-in-Chief of Philadelphia Children's Hospital, later became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General. Dad got into the whole pro-life movement at its beginning. So then a whole nother story started.
Now, did your dad and C. Everett Koop sort of bond over facial hair design? Because both of
Yeah,
those
well,
fellas are famous for a certain kind of facial
yes,
hairstyle. I
yes.
had
And
no
neither
idea
had
that they were
eventual
connected to
peer
each other.
with Dad's goatee and Coop's thing here. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
they
part
sort
of
of,
being
sort
ultra
of,
reformed Calvinist, whatever, but they both grew weird kind of beards. But anyway,
yeah, they did.
so long story short, I found myself 17, 18, 19, going into my 20s, tagging along with Dad on these big speaking trips in the States. And looking back on that, various historians like Randall Balmer and these people who write on this say that that was the beginning of the evangelical involvement with the anti-abortion movement. And so we got tagged with that, and essentially built as a kind of a right-wing empire based on that, of films, multi-million-dollar film series, big seminar tours, speaking to tens of thousands of people in arenas, booking things like Madison Square Garden or the Grand Ole Opry, places like that, and filling them with evangelicals who were tuning into what we were saying. Little footnote on the way through, and then I'll finish with this recap. Um, Most people I talk to, whether they're politicians on the left or evangelicals, don't understand that our big battle in the 70s was not with people like the National Organization of Women or NARAL or Planned Parenthood. It was with the evangelical leaders like Dr. Billy Graham, the evangelist, or Dr. Criswell, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and just I'll say this really slowly, who were adamantly pro-choice,
Yeah.
and fundamentalist Christians and evangelicals, and wanted nothing to do with our anti-abortion crusade. Point blank refused. For instance, Dr. Criswell, who was also at that time the minister of First Baptist in Dallas and the president of Dallas Theological Seminary and the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, if you want to
Right.
talk, you know,
Yeah.
everything at once. He had been on the platform with us when we did our film series, How Should We Then Live, about art and culture. He showed up and was there and endorsed it and loved it and had it shown in his church. Would not appear with us 5 years later when we came back with our anti-abortion series, and argued the points with Dad, making biblical references and so forth and so on. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. So we didn't just start a culture war phenomena in the States that wound up with Donald Trump getting elected, very unintentionally, by the way. Daddy would have hated him many years later. But we also did something really rather awful to the evangelical community. And that is, we gave them a new set of litmus tests to judge people's politics and Christianity on. And of course, then others like Jerry Falwell expanded that to a sort of an anti-gay hate crusade and other things. But sadly, back in the 70s and 80s, I was really on the wrong side of these issues, pushing Dad to do these things, pushing him to be more extreme than he would have been otherwise. And I look back with horror at what we did intentionally and unintentionally. But as a son, I feel that I really betrayed Dad.
Wow.
The interesting thing is, I don't mean I betrayed him now when I turn against what we stood for in the evangelical community. I mean, I betrayed him as a young, ambitious man who used him as a stepping stone to have access to people like Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan and the Bush family and others, and also a whole film career within the evangelical world, and also a highly paid speaking career. As Dad was dying of cancer, I was replacing him, for instance, as the keynote speaker to the Southern Baptist Convention, filling in for him. And evangelicals who have grown up in that community will know that evangelicalism is rife with nepotism. Everybody drags in their family and their cousin and everyone else, put them on the payroll. So it was perfectly, quote, normal for people to say the mantle has passed and now Frank Schaeffer is going to carry on, or Frankie Schaeffer, I was known then. I got out entirely after Dad died because I really had a series of crises of conscience. And also on the aesthetic basis that I realized I was helping something really nefarious, evil, and ugly, whether it was how gay people were being treated or whatever. So the only redeeming quality I can say is I got out. But as a young man, I really betrayed my dad because he could have died peacefully, known for books like Escape from Reason, The God Who Is There, and he would have been remembered as someone a little bit to the left, very progressive in his views of gay people, right, for instance, very kind to people, and totally untouched by this culture war stuff. None of his early books have any of that in it. Now, he was a grown-up. He did what he did. It wasn't just all about me. But as I look back on how I encouraged that element of what he was doing in the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years of his life, I'm really saddened by that.
Mm.
And one of the things I've been trying to do as I talk about Dad, and look at this whole period of our history, is help people separate out the threads and realize there was also another Francis Schaeffer who was open to people, kind to people, had an intentional community before there were such things, et cetera, et cetera. And not only that, wrote some books with real intellectual firepower to them, like The God Who Is There,
Yeah,
which,
yeah.
agree or disagree, is not a political book. So that's the end of my spiel. Kind of brings
Well,
me up
I
to
think it's a really helpful spiel because it reminds me that the way our social structures are is often because people have made it that way. And you've given a piece of the story with names and people and intentions, and you realize we have this world that we have because it's been socially structured and created.
yeah,
And it can be created in another way.
yeah,
Right? There's choices that were made. Your dad made choices, you made, all the characters involved were making choices. And sometimes
yeah,
those choices were clear, and sometimes I'm sure they were, there was impact and result that people didn't anticipate. But we really
yeah,
do live in a world that's not just tumbling down a hill. It's a world in which human beings are making the world that we're going to live in. And I just think that that's an important piece, because you can look back and just say, well, this is the way it always was, and there's nothing you can do about it, and we just have to
mhm,
contend with, religious people that are hardwired into a certain political view, and they don't even know why they're hardwired in. And you can go back a bit in your own history and say, well, this might be one of the reasons, because we created
yeah.
a reward system and we created a social system that said this is the path to follow.
Yeah, not only that, we were lured by and also helped create incentives for political operatives who were very cynically using what we were doing. I mean, Ronald Reagan is the ultimate example. Reagan was pro-choice. He legalized abortion in California. He had a couple meetings with Jack Kemp, who was our friend, a congressman. My parents used to stay in his home. I stayed with Jack quite often, who had been influenced by our film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and before that, How Should We Then Live? Jack talked to Ronald Reagan and explained to him that he was one change of public policy away from garnering this powerful movement, and really made a deal with the evangelicals to put him in power with that speech he made to the national religious broadcasters when he said, you can't endorse me. This was back in the day when
Yeah.
religious broadcasters still pretended there was a separation of church and state, but I can endorse you. Of course, that's changed to the point now where religious organizations are 100% political. But back then, there was that pretense of separation of church and state. Ronald Reagan was able to do that because he understood that with these litmus test hot button issues, you could motivate rather apathetic evangelicals who were into this weird Jesus cult, as he saw it, because he certainly was not a born again Christian in terms we would have understood. But you could motivate them. And then, of course, the fundraising aspect of that
Yeah.
propelled people like Jerry Falwell and Dr. Dobson and others, so that it was red meat to people who had an agenda. And then there was a huge, sincere, large public, one of whom was myself, who got into the anti-abortion crusade, having gotten Jeannie pregnant when I was 17 and 18. We had kept the baby being my daughter Jessica, the mother of Amanda and Ben, against the advice of Jeannie's friends and even people in L'Abri, because, as I say, there were a lot of pro-choice evangelicals at the time. And of course, looking back, it was incredibly unfair, which is something I get into in my new book. And that is, we had a community that supported us. All our medical bills were paid. We were given a free apartment to live in for 5 years. I had two sisters in the community and innumerable L'Abri workers who would babysit,
Wow.
help us.
Mm-hmm.
We ate all the meals we wanted to eat were up in the common dining room. We didn't even have to prepare our own food, let alone go shopping. If every couple who wants to have a child, whether married or pair bonded or gay or straight or individual, unpair bonded, single, non-binary folks who want to have children, if they got 10% of the support we had within this intentional evangelical community, there are a lot more people who would be having children. And in addition to which, when they did, they would have this incredible layer of support. So it was from that kind of self-centered, selfish background that I became a pro-lifer, as in, why can't you do what I did? Why can't
Mhm.
you do what Jeannie and I did? And of course, that's incredibly ugly because it's from not only a position of white privilege, it's from a position of familiar privilege and connection.
Yeah,
So
right.
when I look back, my motivation was real at that point. I didn't want Jessica to have been aborted, but it was completely based in a level of privilege and being catered to that 99% of the human race at any given moment don't have. And so of course it was completely ridiculous. And now my view has changed much further than that in terms of embracing women's rights. I consider myself a pretty ardent feminist, as a man can be. But back then, even on the basis of what I was pitching, it was unfair.
So that brings us to this new book, which is interesting. Now, look, you're an author. You've written a dozen books, a bunch of films. You're a lecturer, all of that. But you've really thrown yourself into this one. I heard you talk about it a couple weeks ago when we were together in New York.
Yeah.
You This feels, I don't want to call it sort of a capstone, but it feels to me like this book is trying to get at what this last stage of your life has been about. That
Yeah.
this is more of a cumulative work that you've done. You've worked really hard on it. So, and I think it'd be worth people talking about it. The book is called "Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy." I've heard you now reference it just as "Fall in Love." Is that just your
Yeah.
shorthand, or is the
No,
title of the
that's my
book in your
dyslexia.
mind?
No, that's my dyslexia kicking in, literally,
Okay.
where, I can barely remember short titles of my own books. I have to look sitting right in front of me. I mean, isn't
Yeah.
this pathetic? I've got this sitting here so that I don't have to look at the screen here and read my own book title off of
Yeah,
it.
I've
But the
I've done
thing
the
is,
same thing. Yeah.
yeah, the long title is deliberate because I want to essentially, first of all, start by saying what we were selling back in the day was fake family values. So we
Mhm.
talked about family values, but they were fake because they were exclusionary. We weren't interested in including people in our family who were gay. I'm not talking about the Schaeffer family, in terms of the religious right. We weren't really, we didn't offer women any choices at all. We told them to either have an abortion or have a child that either they couldn't afford or didn't want or had some fetal anomaly or a problem, or come into a marriage where they were already stressed with 4 kids. We didn't offer any real choices. In other words, let's say back in the day we had gone out with an anti-abortion message that was predicated upon the fact that before we even could question Roe v. Wade and its legitimacy, we would need to have an entire revamp of the American social policy when it came to how we spend our tax dollars, that we would have paid maternity leave, paid paternity leave. People would be able to take a year off from work and come back to their job with no problem whatsoever about rejoining their company, and no social stigma either. That anyone who had a child would get a government stipend from the time the child was born till they were 18, which would mean that no one would be listed as working poor, that we would have a minimum wage that back in those days would have been about $15, now would be $25 to $30 an hour, so that anybody who had a job would not be in the working poor category. The contraceptives would be free, that abortion and abortion testing and testing for fetal anomaly would be free, that we would have a level of education when it came to sex education that was more about relationships and dignity and respect than it was simply about how babies are made. After we did all that, let's talk about abortion. But we didn't. We just told people they didn't have any choices at all. We took away all
Yeah.
the real choices and so forth. So, what my book, Fall in Love, Have Children, I'm reading off the cover,
Yeah.
Stay Put,
Good.
Save the Planet, Be Happy, is a definitely provocative title that could have been written by a Mormon or an evangelical fundamentalist.
Yeah, I
And
was going to ask you about that.
I'm
Yeah.
doing it for the same reason that my left wing friend in Santa Monica one day, about 20 years ago, stuck a big American flag on a pole on his house. He said, "Look, I'm not allowing this flag to just be stolen by Republicans and right wingers. It belongs to us too." And I'm saying real family values belongs to progressive people more than it belongs to fundamentalist Christians, conservative Roman Catholics, Mormons, and others, or right wing Trump Republicans, because ordinary human beings, because of our evolutionary past, correspond to relationships, to community, to caring for each other, what I call in the book the survival of the friendliest. So essentially, I am waving this cover around deliberately and provocatively,
Yeah.
saying, just like the American flag and patriotism also belongs to progressive people, fall in love, have children, stay put, save the planet, be happy belongs to everyone. It belongs to non-binary people. It belongs to people who don't have children, because we're all parents in the sense we are all caregivers. That's what we're
Yeah.
built to be. And so I'm trying to reclaim the entire territory and take it back for people who think that family values are rooted in our evolutionary history, not in a series of laws given by various kinds of
Nice.
cults and or religions, but that this actually corresponds to who we evolved to be, which is caregivers, the survival of the friendliest, builders of community, those who are inclusive. So back in our hunter-gatherer days, if you didn't share the food, you didn't just die, everybody around you died, and that meant you died because
Yeah.
your selfishness killed you, which is why we learned to have empathy, and so on and so on. So that's what the book is about. It took about 5 years because as I got into it and started sending it to my more sciencey friends, I got too many reactions saying, hey, you have not done enough reading. You have not read the books. Here's somebody else you need to go. What I thought was going to take about 1.5 years wound up taking closer to 6. So this book has a lot of research in it, but it also has a lot of my own life in it, a kind of a mea culpa, being open about the mistakes I made, why some of the things that in my own life I'm so ashamed of in terms of the way I treated my children when I was this young Calvinist father who thought I was to be in charge and discipline and all the rest of this, how I have those regrets. And I'm hoping that by sharing some of that, I can write to people, not from a position of saying, hey, I have all the answers, but here's a little piece of a journey that got me from here to here and got me looking at for some real family values, the things that we really build community with, instead of all these easy answers and God says stuff and here it's in the Bible and so on and so on. There's much better reasons for empathy, and there's much better reasons for caring for each other than some weird patriarchal biblical model that so many evangelicals and others have latched onto. And so the book is trying to reclaim that territory. And that's why I have an in-your-face title about having children and so forth, not in any way telling people they've got to follow some heterosexual model of monogamy and all the rest of this, but rather saying, look, this belongs to everybody.
Yeah, you have this great line somewhere in the first chapter that I pulled out that you say, as we shall see, evolution's rule for success is this: cooperate, be friendly, help others, survive. Like that notion that we're hardwired for social connection, that we're hardwired for empathic life with each other.
Yeah.
That is something that very often the sciencey side of us, which a lot of progressives want to talk about science, doesn't sort of lean into those kind of softer social cohesion narratives. And I just think we're in a struggle right now inside of progressive spaces where, and progressivism is always on a continuum, right? Progressive compared to whom, right?
Sure.
But so people that find themselves like wanting to lean into something more full life and progressive in that way, they often don't have, they don't have a guide for it. People feel like, boy, if you're in a religious community or you're in a conservative community, there's a lot of guides, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of reference points, there's a lot of community cohesion that keeps you in the tribe.
Yes.
Once you break free from that, it's like you're just feral. I mean, I talk to so many people who I know are going to love this book because they're just looking for partners along the journey and people who can help them think about these things and put the pieces together. And it's almost as if there's this narrative. Once you wake up, once you're awakened and you're seeing the world as it is, and you want to move forward and leave behind what, the biblical narrative might call the childish things, right? The more control system of childhood. You're kind of on your own, and hey, good luck, everybody. And all suggestion of how someone should live is off the hook, and no one wants to make any suggestion to anybody about how they should be. It can feel really lonely. And I know a lot of people, they just go back to the cohesion narratives, not because they want to be controlled, but because they don't want to be alone. And I think you're kind of getting at that. Is that right? I mean,
Absolutely. Exactly right. And I would just throw a few things out. First of all, having done some reading over the last 5.5, almost 6 years now for this book, what surprised me coming from an evangelical background, and since having left it, I've done some reading. This isn't the first reading I've done, but what really surprised me is how the good science of evolution, and I don't mean good in a moral sense, but the most up-to-date and relevant and the ones that sciencey people say is the best, has changed. recently in the last 20 years. Remember that book called The Selfish Gene? There was an idea around
Yeah.
the survival of the fittest, that somehow we're built to be selfish. Our genes are what are actually ruling us. The survival of our genes are what everything is about. Empathy, kindness, and these things are just sort of window dressing, but actually underneath it's hard, it's cruel, survival of the fittest. The funny thing is, all the recent science, and it's not driven by any kind of, Christianity or any quote moral teaching, is quite the opposite. It's all revolves around something that people are calling the survival of the friendliest, and that is that empathy is actually linked to survival. Being a hard-ass, selfish jerk doesn't work very well in community. Our genes have basically evolved for caring for one another because this is actually what keeps you alive. And that is feeling a sense of responsibility in community. And then, of course, there's a huge dark side to all of this because those communities then cohere and turn against others in defensive posture. And that's part of it. But it was a surprise to me to find out a sort of a cart and a horse thing. Coming from an evangelical background where my dad always used the direction of society as a kind of an apologetic for pitching Christianity. Hey, without our morals or without our family structure or without these things, look what will happen. It'll be a free-for-all. Actually, that's not the case. It's the other way around. Because we evolved empathy in order to survive, we relate to teachings by figures like Jesus, who essentially put into moral structure teaching the better parts of what evolution has already proved to be true for the survival of humans. And so it resonates because we know on a much deeper level that has nothing to do with faith or belief or joining a church or a particular religion, that this actually works. So that when you look at the teachings of Jesus, now there would be evangelicals out there who are creationists or whatever. I'm not one of them. But they would flip it and say, well, see, this is a further apologetic proof of the divine hand in creation and so on. Maybe, but let's set that aside for a minute and just realize, and this sort of is a little bit mind-blowing, that actually evolution is a very moral guide. Morality does not come from religion. Morality predates formal religion by tens of thousands of years. And what we have instead is a way to survive that has been taught to us, as it were. That's my dog barking. I'm going to have to bring Zip in a minute.
Because that dog is not going to give up. Yeah, that dog's going to win. That dog's going to win the day.
That has taught us that essentially, if we do believe in things like the selfish gene, for instance, obviating responsibility to others, that this isn't going to work very well. While you talk a little bit, I'm just going to open that door and bring Zip.
That's absolutely no problem. In fact, I'll suggest to you, Frank, and to others, and maybe, Frank, you've read this book, but I was deeply impacted by a book called Give and Take by a person named Adam Grant back in 2013. This one's really, really worth looking at. He suggests that there's three kinds of people: givers, matchers, and takers. And it's basically getting at this idea. He's talking about how do you succeed in social context. And he has this question where he asks people, hey, do you think who's more successful in the world, givers, matchers, or takers? And you can imagine what a giver is, right? The people that put others' needs in front of simply their own and they participate in another one's world. Takers are those who use relationships to extract their own benefit. And matchers live in this pseudo quid pro quo kind of world. And he asks a story. He says, of medical doctors, who do you think does best, givers, matchers, or takers? And then he says, well, in medical school, takers come in first and givers come in last until they get to residency. And then it flips. In residency, then givers come in first and takers come in last, because when you're in medical school, you're competing against each other and you don't want someone else to cheat off of your sheet. You want to be first in the class. So if you want to be successful, you go to medical school and you act as a taker. You take in everything you can and you protect it and keep it for yourself. But by the time you get to residency, where you're dealing with people and human interactions and you're having to learn how to be a doctor in the real world, then it's all about cooperation and participation, and then givers do best in the world. So we have a narrative. We've all heard a phrase like, well, nice guys finish last. And that's true in some systems, but the system of life itself
Mm.
givers don't come in last, right?
Right.
And this is what I feel like your book, when you talk about love, it's kind of
Mm.
curious because, first of all, a lot of people that know Frank Schaeffer or have been around you and watched you, you are a fiery personality, right? We traveled together in 2018 on a bus, and you're so fun to be with in front of a crowd. You know how to rile people up. You've got this sort of spark plug kind of zeal that comes out. There's people who think, well, when I think love, I don't really think, you know, the hard edged, straight talking Frank Schaeffer,
Mm.
because a lot of times people think love is somehow the pushover, the soft, the malleable, the non-serious. Like if you're serious about the world, then you're going to use something other than love. Like love
Mm.
can't be your driving force. And Frank, even religious people, when you talk about love being the primary drive for human beings, I've talked to lots of leaders, lots of them on this podcast, who will even say, like, I don't really know what people are talking about when they talk about love. Like that's a little ethereal. Let's talk about the
Yeah.
real world that we're
Yeah.
in. And you get at this thing partly through your granddaughter Nora, who sort of and children have a way of doing this that sort of clarify the mind
Mm.
around love. Can you talk a bit about
Yes.
love as a means of human engagement?
Well, the first thing to say is that if you do a little reading in this area, as I was forced to do by my sciencey friends who would write me emails saying, you cannot, you gotta, here's four more things you've got to do before you even think about writing this chapter. Um, what's curious to me is that love is not chosen and it's not sentimental. So that, yes, I have stories about Nora and Lucy and my grandchildren and childcare and my experience of love. But the funny thing is that love is actually very scientifically measurable. For instance, my dog Zip has brain waves because we co-evolved together that can be measured along with mine. And as long as there is neurological science out there to measure it, where his actual experience of the same chemicals in his brain that I'm experiencing when I, pick him up right now because he's at my feet. This is real, and you can hook him up with little wires on his head, as they do in various universities that I quote in the book, and measure that he's feeling what I'm feeling right now. And he wags his tail. I give him a little kiss. Something real is going on. Okay, so he's giving me a kiss here because he's actually feeling something. Now, the funny thing is, gay adoptive parents, gay males, single or pair bonded with another male, can have, as they've been studying for 20 years now, the chemical composition in their hormonal structure and also
Mm.
brain waves. This isn't a theory anymore. This is absolutely demonstrated, and I cite it in my book and talk about the studies that have literally proved this. A gay male adoptive parent who bonds closely with a child, in other words, spends real time with them, doesn't just cart them off to another caregiver, but is with them the same kind of hours that a biological female parent have exactly the same functions going on in the brain, both chemically, hormonally, and that are scannable as a mother with a newborn child she's breastfeeding. So that the actual power of love
Wow.
as a chemical brainwave reality in minds that are dedicated to another human being, not even biologically related, an adoptive parent, are being measured and being documented now. So love is not an idea. Love is
Yeah.
real. It's as real as anything out there. It is hormonally measurable. It is biologically measurable. And love came about in our evolution for real reasons. And I'll tell you exactly what everybody says. This is a simplified thumbnail, but the science is there. Really easy. Because we're born with really big heads. We would kill all our mothers if our brains were fully developed. So the brains continue to develop because we're all born prematurely compared to other primates who stand up and shake off and walk around a few minutes later compared to us.
Yeah, interesting.
Childhoods for humans are very, very long, which means that women cannot do all the caregiving alone, which means that there was an incredible biological invention of empathy and love to give us all motives to stick around for the 5, 6, 10, 18 years it takes to raise a child. It really does take a village. We all had to develop the ability to sense love, community, and attachment to those we were not biological parents of, because the isolated human female cannot both hunter-gatherer and feed Someone has to feed her, which means that biology, evolution, invented something. It's called the father. And the father is not a male. The father is any help caregiver, whether it's another female in a lesbian relationship, can be turned the same way, in exactly the same way that I'm not being sentimental when I say that I can experience what a mother experiences as a biological female, as a male, as fully invested in the caregiving process of Nora as her biological mother is, experiencing the same things in my brain because of my level of commitment. So that all of this stuff about love being chosen and ephemeral and sort of out there and romantic and all the rest of it, sure, literature adopts it and we paint it and we sing it and we do it. But the basis for love and empathy in human evolution is that we have long childhoods. If there are not long-term caregivers around, we don't survive. And so women from time immemorial, as many writers, a lot of feminist writers as well, have always had to look for help in childcare. This isn't some invention of modern industry where people have got to have a job and a daycare center and so forth and so on. This goes with the territory back to the year dot. It's all rooted into biology and evolution created the feeling we have that we call love, this warm feeling of connection at 3 a.m. We have this crying child. We hate it in one way. We'd rather have it dead than wake us again. And yet when you pick that baby up, all of a sudden, whether you're a father or a mother or a lesbian or gay or non-binary, doesn't matter, you're attached. You get this warm blood that says, wow, this is all worth it. And it's the same thing in all our relationships. The payoff is love, and the payoff has been squandered by our culture, and it's been squandered. And this is the big point I make in my book, because we have the wrong definition of success. If you measure success in life, what you were saying a moment ago about people who give and so forth and so on, and nice guys finish last, this kind of stuff. If you measure success in terms of, say, how many millions of dollars you make or your position of power over others, that gives one kind of result, one sort of culture. If you measure success in a completely different way, and that is the quality of your relationships, that gives you a completely different society. You spend your money differently, you have different priorities, you have different heroes, you have different things you follow. And basically what my book is trying to do is redefine the idea of success, not based on some moral teaching, but based on something much more measurable. What actually makes people happy? What actually makes people fulfilled? What actually gives us joy? And it's not based on what should give us joy according to a Bible study. It's what on actually works because of who we evolved to be. And here's the key, as long-term caregivers. And we are all long-term caregivers of those around us, and happy, or we do not give care and we only look into ourselves, and we will be lonely and sad. And that really plays out now in our culture and what's happening around us. So I'm not calling people back to some sort of good life and more moral. I'm calling back folks who read this book to something that works. And so, you know, the book is for people who are parenting or want to be parents, but it's also for people who are completely single and unattached, but still measure their life's value by the relationships in their life around them.
Yeah, and people who understand that we all live inside of a human family system, right? That we're caregivers of one another. That we're experiencing something right now here in Minnesota that my son, who lives in New York, also said was happening in New York yesterday, which is that smoke from wildfires in Canada have made the air yesterday totally cloudy and hazy.
It was the same here. Yesterday, the sky was orange. It was like the visions of the apocalypse.
And you begin to think, a fire burning in the abandoned woods of Canada is not only making a difference in the air in Minnesota, but in Massachusetts and in New York and all that. We live inside of an entire system. There's just moments where we recognize that. The pandemic is one of those moments. Politics reminds us of those moments. Religion is supposed to remind us of our interconnectedness. And this is what I think's genius about your idea, that we're all caregivers and we're all being cared for by others.
Yes,
so this obligation, which, in religious terms that I'll throw in for a minute, is, am I my brother's keeper, right? It's not a question of, are you in the same family or not? Yeah. But if you like human family, yes, we're all in the human family. but do we have an obligation to one another or not? And I think what you're pulling on is, yeah, we actually do have an obligation to one another.
Yeah. The funny thing is, we have an obligation to ourselves. And the weird thing is, and I know this sounds counterintuitive, but if you want to be clever about your selfishness, redefine success in your own life if you really want to experience joy. That's the message of the book. It isn't that if we all have an obligation to others, it'll be a better world. That's the footnote. Yeah, it will be. But I have something really basic to ask people. Do you want to experience joy in your life? Because if you do,
happy?
Are you happy? And if you do, then there's literally only one path, and it's not the path of Christianity or Buddhism or anything else. It is the path of understanding that the way you evolved is in a certain direction. It has nothing to do with gender. It has nothing to do with sexuality. It has to do with a common human attribute that unless you are feeling cared for and giving care to others, you will not be happy, period. And so for those people who jump on board with the sort of lean-in philosophy, for instance, of that is being put by certain executives who want females to emulate 1950s males and leave everything else behind and just do career, or conversely, domineering American evangelical men who think that God has put them in charge, where these ideas that seem to be on opposite ends of the spectrum but are really the same thing fall completely apart is it puts any construct, political, religious, moral, scientific, whatever, ahead of the basic prime directive, and that is the survival of the friendliest. And so when you look at someone like Michelle Obama, who I talk about in my book, pushing back against this lean-in philosophy, saying, well, how's that working out for you, as if somehow leaning into another selfish, high-powered career is the answer for everybody. Michelle Obama pushed back on that precisely because in her own life, she's found that what she cares most about is her relationships. Now, that doesn't mean she didn't have a high-powered career. She did. But it meant that at some point she realized that her two daughters and her husband and the love they share was more important to her than this other stuff. Now, my book doesn't say, therefore, let's all go home and women not have careers and men not build lives around them and so forth. I do something completely different. I say more power to everybody who's out there doing things. Let's rebuild society so that we actually can feed what is best and most beautiful in our lives. For instance, just give one example. We ought to have a system of both law and the way we spend our taxes to make it incredibly not only easy, but completely normal for parents to swap off when they have a very young child, say between birth and age 4, so that we don't expect everybody to have to always go to work and choose between career and childcare, that it's all one package. And it's a package that the whole of society is glad to pick up. So, it isn't a question that we've gone in the wrong direction. It's that we haven't even started offering people real choices. And I'm not just talking about having children. I mean, in all areas of balancing career and life, weirdly enough, it always seems to be the shareholders that win the discussion. And I'm saying, no, back to square one. And of course, now we're post-COVID, and you have a lot of people wanting to continue to work out of their homes. You have people who realize that they were pushing too hard and they'd like to go to a 4-day work week. I'm hoping that my book is a little contribution to what is going to become a movement, not because I started it, because I'm not, it's happening anyway, but that I can help direct it a little more in a direction of empathy and caring for each other, rather than just sort of another selfish construct.
Yeah, and look, we've learned a lot. Like you've mentioned, our science has learned a lot. Our own experience has learned a lot. I think even our social evolution has changed in the last 2,000, 3,000 years, comparatively. We're at a different place, and the world is at a different place. Frankly, there's different evolutionary realizations happening sort of all over the world. And those of us who live in the societies like we live in, this highly technological, interconnected society of complexity, we're experiencing something as human beings that's wholly new to the human experience, right? So we can do things now that match this moment, not the ones that match the 1750s or the 1850s. There are some similarities that carry over. There's some great moral and ethical teachings that all of our religious traditions should point us toward, like love one another is the greatest call, right? Like that is something that should carry forward for all peoples. but what that means, we now know is different. There really were people who truly believed the best way you could learn, I'm
Mm.
sorry, the best way you could love was to be away from your family, providing for them. That
Yeah.
that's a construct that people, they just really believed. When you
Mm.
said to someone like, "Why are you traveling right now and away from your family?" Well, I need to provide for my family as an act of care and love. And there are times when that literally, that's all people could do,
Sure.
right? They had to just go and work. But now so many people are in a place where like the opposite of that would be important, right? Find a
Mm.
way to stay home. So what I'm getting at is we need to have a view of the world and a structure of the world that fits now, not one that
Mm.
just fits some sort of 100, 200, 500,000 year
Yeah.
old story. And that's going to be, that has to be argued for. And I think you're arguing for it. There's a lot of other people who are arguing for it.
Yeah.
You see these whole movements of people that are like businessy stuff having nothing to do with morality or societal development. And they're like, people need to sleep more. They need to care
Right.
for the planet. People need to
Yeah.
slow down and be like, all of that is because we've now tested the limits of this, and we
Yeah.
know and can look around the world and see where these things have worked and where they haven't. And American
Yeah.
society is now at a reckoning point with this.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I think evolution is still ongoing. And I don't just mean in the chosen sense, but it's actually molding us and shaping us. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is that it seems to me that one of the evolutionary steps actually in our lifetime that we have seen happen, I mean, you and me are old enough to say in our lifetimes, is
Yeah.
the advent of modern feminism. I say modern feminism because feminism, of course, is as old as history itself. But the modern advent of feminism came about in my lifetime. And I don't think that modern feminism is something that just happened because a few people wrote books. I think it's an actual evolutionary step key to
Nice.
the survival of the human race. Because I think that feminism has shown the way, and I have a whole chapter on this in my book, that gives us an opportunity to do those things we need to do, not just by choice, but by necessity. So that, for instance, when it comes to egalitarian culture, we look at the societies in which males, okay, to look at it from the male perspective, live longest are the cultures with the most enlightened feminist legal setup, but
Yeah.
also sociologically. So, Iceland, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, men live almost as long, statistically almost dead even with women. There are no exceptions to this, by the way. The lower the view of women in any culture, the worse off men are, whether it's suicide rates,
Wow.
whether it is mental breakdown, and all the rest of this. And then the final measure of all human theories, I guess you could say, is the actuarial table of longevity. If you're dead, that pretty much indicates that you weren't, and so when it comes to smoking or diabetes and all these other things, we measure all these things along mortality and so
Yeah.
on. Well, without exception, and the studies I cite in my book are conclusive on this, the cultures in which male mortality fares best, men live longest, are all
Hmm.
those societies across the board that have adopted the most cutting edge feminist proposals, whether it comes to childcare, whether it comes to shared responsibility at home, whether it comes to laws protecting women against violence and brutality, across the board. And the cultures with the lowest views of women in different societies are the ones that fare least well, forget women for a minute, for men. And so there are so many indications that feminism itself is an evolutionary step for the whole species, not simply for the female of the species. And again, it's because it actually fits with what works in an evolutionary sense. Obviously, care for one another, egalitarian opportunity, um, equality across the sexes, uh, rights for individuals when it comes to what we do, how we earn our living. These things actually work well for
Mm.
everybody. So
Uh-huh.
that I don't just think it's a question of calling people to become their better selves. I think it is pointing to the actual truth
Yeah.
of what we evolved to be. And unfortunately, we have a horror show of examples on the other side, some of which I cite in the book, in terms of the societies or the parts of culture that don't do well. And a lot of that also matches up. Just throw one statistic out, and that is 4 times more American police officers die every year by suicide with a handgun than are killed in the line of duty. You look at numbers like that, and inside that statistic is a story of despair, a story of what actually owning a firearm sometimes leads to, that has nothing to do with theories or what the NRA is saying or ideas of masculinity or any of these other things. Now we're actually cutting to the chase here and seeing how all this works out for people. And the same thing comes to relationships, and that is the relationships that last best are obviously the ones in which men and women, and I tell a little of this story in my book of going from a kind of a patriarch dominating male who was raised to be that to someone who sees things very differently, with a really good tutor, that being my wife, Jeannie, who has helped me over the years, really, really change the kind of bedrock of how I see our relationship. This wasn't because I was getting bullied and pushed into something that I now regret. It's the difference between me having a suicidal impulse for many, many years as someone who suffered from some depression and someone who doesn't. So that, a man living in a relationship of equal friendship with a woman, which Jeannie and I have gotten to because of her patience and tutorial ability and kindness with me, her husband is now not just quite happy, actually. I'm not someone who's tempted to commit suicide quite regularly any longer. That's an actual measurement. Okay, so when I hear about people killing themselves with handguns who are police and so on and so on, when I hear about how males are so unhappy in what are called traditional relationships, which is bullshit because they're only traditional in the sense they go back to a certain period of patriarchal history. Back in the hunter-gathering era of human relationships, men and women were completely equal because they were living in a tribal situation that was completely different. So, but if I look at how this worked out in my own life, the story I tell in the book is not just one of theory. It's that, here's someone who grew up groomed to be a bully and in a patriarchal culture where the Bible says blah, 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 who changed and who found not only that this works better for wives and children and spouses and whatever your relationship, but I'm not tempted to commit suicide anymore.
Nice.
And I contemplated killing myself a lot when I was trying to live by that other rule. Not because it was, quote, morally wrong, but if you want to pretend that a brick wall is not there and put your head down and charge straight into it, you will split your head open. And when you charge again and again and again into the brick wall of patriarchy saying, I'm a man and I'm in charge, I'm also in love with this woman and I'm trying to be a good father, it does not work. You feel like killing yourself because of the sorrow you're spreading because of your stupid ideas. So that this book is very personal to me that way.
That's great. It reminds me, I heard from a friend and a professor named Monica Coleman. She taught a course that I helped to lead called Womanist Theology. And I wasn't familiar with womanism and its contrast to feminism. And she roots it in the race of the founders, that feminism tended in the United States to be a white woman movement. And womanism was a black woman movement coming about the same time. And among many things that Monica said that were so great, one of them that I recall was she said, basically feminists in the 50s and 60s were saying, we want the right to work. And womanists, black women, were saying, we want the right to not have to work. We've had to work the whole time. Sure. Men aren't around. Society doesn't pay us enough. We're doing nothing but working. And so the liberation for us is we want a society where we don't have to work. The feminists were saying we've been held down, kept at home, ignored, can't become astronauts, can't become people that lead in this society. We want the chance to work. And it's both of those are lived realities. That's sort of what I'm hearing you say, when you talk about men who feel that same struggle, right? Is there's a sense in which the freedom that we need is really rooted in where and how we feel and trapped. And
again, I think it goes back to how do we define success, and that in turn defines what our priorities are. So look, it's not a perfect world. We're all going to compromise. We all have to do certain things at certain periods of our life. There's that period of striving. There's that period of getting ahead. There's the period of being a student, a young person, young parent. But in terms of the whole arc of our life, what we're aiming for in every phase is that we put relationships first. And that is not a selfless thing. In fact, it
Yeah.
means we're putting our happiness first. So, I have a really basic question. I mean, if you're in a pair bonded relationship, whether gay or straight or whatever it is, um, if you really want to be happy, make the person you're with happy.
That's
Duh.
right.
I mean, this is not rocket science. But you know
Yeah.
what? I mean, seriously, if more people could understand that, things would
Yeah,
work
it's
out
true.
better for everybody. So, I mean, this is not like something I have not come up with anything new here. What I am simply doing is what's new for me is
Yeah.
putting together some of the science in my own past ignorance with the intuition of
Yes.
what I have learned simply being a father and a grandfather, and making those two into one book. And then on top of that is a personal journey as a mea culpa, patriarchal person into a new way of seeing things, not theoretically, but now, that I've been living for a good 20, 30 years as someone very, very different from the person that Jeannie hooked up with when she was this, teenager who stumbled into
Mhm.
L'Abri, the ministry my parents were running, not even knowing where she was.
Yeah. I don't want to blame things totally on the chemical makeup, but I have a suspicion. I'm guessing scientists already know this and will know it even more. That
Hmm.
testosterone has a lot to do with the problems that we experience in the
Yes.
world. Um, you can almost see it. I know people who've done testosterone therapies. Maybe
Hmm.
they're transitioning in how they live in the world, and they're taking away
Yeah.
testosterone or adding it in. Or my wife, who is fine with me saying this, but when she was 30, had a hysterectomy, so she's been on
Yeah.
some kind of a testosterone supplement.
Yes.
And whether that's doesn't do synthetic stuff, so it's like bull's testicles, and so she
Yeah.
knows very well the impact. Or you see a young man reach puberty, and there's
Yes.
something about like that thing that chemical does to
Yes.
your social construct. Um, and then people get older, and we all know, and they sell a lot of chemicals to men our ages to try to deal with
Mm.
the fact that you have a declining testosterone level. But boy, you
Yeah.
start to decline your testosterone a little as you reach older ages, and you're like,
Hmm.
this is way better. Like, just
Yes.
get
This is way better.
knocking that edge and that dry,
Yeah.
and then people are trying to pump it back in. And look, I know that this can have a lot of physiological effects for people,
Yeah.
something to do with not sexuality, but there's like this huge push to sell more testosterone into men that
Yeah.
feels like it's contrary to what we want. So it feels like in some ways, and this is the evolutionary struggle, that
Yeah.
part of our psychology and part of our consciousness has to deal with our biology and
Yes.
not just simply be a biological creature that is
Yeah.
only driving by our own biology. I'll just say one more thing about this. Saw this study where they studied the amount of testosterone release in
Mm.
men when they're in groups with just other men.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then what happens when women are in those groups, like just in a boardroom. They study
Yes.
the testosterone levels, and the testosterone levels go up. Just having a woman in the room
Hmm.
putting out feminine and pheromones, the
Yeah.
testosterone level comes down. So they
Yeah.
literally say you're in a dangerous situation when you have an overly high testosterone level at a board level where people are
Yeah.
making decisions. One of the ways to tamper that is to really make sure you're changing the physiological experience of people in that room by being sure that people across the gender spectrum are available in that room. So it feels like that's part of it. Did you talk about this at all in your book? Do you have this
Yes, I do.
experience?
And I do again in the chapter on feminism, and in other chapters, I point out something that relates directly to what you're saying, and that is how much better populations did in nations led by women than they did by men in the COVID epidemic when it first hit. Of course, now there's all sorts of transmutions and it's different. But if you compare Bolsonaro in Brazil, this sort of hyped up evangelical convert, right wing Trump guy, or Trump, or the Ayatollah in Iran, or the Hindu nationalist leaders of India, they all did badly because they lied to their people in the same way that stupid men, speaking as a man, who won't go to the doctor when they have something they should have seen, or, hey, I can beat this, I don't have to do,
Yeah.
it'll kill you. And they've killed whole countries and hundreds of thousands of people who died needlessly because they took that sort of macho, testosterone-fed approach to, this hoax called COVID in Trump's terms. But, we can beat this and I'm strong and I can go, and then worse yet, Trump gets it and then he goes in with, 70 doctors working on him. Of course, barely survives, but does. But the whole macho bullshit thing, when it even comes to personal health, is why men have such a high rate of mortality for so many things that, any sensible person would go to the doctor on, because they're still being driven by this idea of how other men look at them. Are you, whatever. And of course, when that comes to national leadership, if you have a con artist like Donald Trump in charge of your country, and then on top of that, he's trying to prove his own manhood through a whole life of molesting women and philandering and all the rest of it, of a really pitiful character, if you really think about it. If you knew someone like this, you'd feel sorry for them on a personal level. It's obviously a very sad life of missed opportunities to grow close to anyone. But that whole aspect of what our culture asks of men pushes something that actually we ought to deal with as a problem, in the same way we deal with vestigial organs like appendix or our tonsils as a problem. We recognize that as human beings, we did not evolve to be perfect. We put on sunblock. We do all kinds of stuff to expand our ability to live and to live well. We watch our weight. We do these things. So, if just left to our own devices, this stuff's not perfect. Well, one of the sad things about the religious background I come from is that if you had thought of anything that a young man doesn't need to hear, it's that you're in charge of everybody around you and have a right to push them around. In fact, take a look at the Old Testament here. Not only are men in charge, but if the women veer from the path, you can drag them to the gate of the city and stone them to death, because you're you're the upholder of this tradition. So, the last thing a young man needs to hear from a father or an uncle or a mother or any caregiver or another person, let alone his preacher, is that, those women who want to have an opinion or talk or preach in church or say something, hey, God is on your side. At the very moment of your life when your testosterone and your male stuff is all flaring and you want to draw all attention to yourself and do all this and preening and the rest of it, hey, not only is that all good, this is what God intended. So that the sad thing about so much conservative religion, whether it's Islamic or Christian, Hindu nationalism, led by a male patriarchal leadership, is that they then use their religions to enforce the worst aspect of what it means to be a man anyway. So, you get a double whammy, because someone could say, look, you want to put on sunblock and lean against the fact that you're a bronzed god. This is really stupid. You're not a bronzed god. You're going to be a cancer patient. Put some sunblock on and be willing to be a little more pale. Somebody ought to be telling that to any young man. Listen, see, all this stuff that's churning in you. Guess what? It's going to kill you if you don't do something about it. And if your idea of success in life is to have decent relationships with other human beings, not primarily with women, but anybody, you don't want to be this guy, because there's a term for this. And that is, you will become a world-class asshole by divine right if you're not careful.
That's right.
And guess what? Who's going to be most unhappy? It's you.
Yeah.
So, when you read these statistics that 4 times more police officers die by their own hand than are killed in the line of duty, I relate to that, because the times that I came closest to suicide were back in the day when I was a bully by divine right, telling, spanking children, screaming at my wife, pouncing around, being so important. One of the reasons I got out of the evangelical community is I hated myself within that environment. Not because I was reading the Bible differently or got psychological counseling or something. No, just because of what a burden it is to be a jerk. It's a real burden. You're the one that suffers most, far more than the people around you, because you never escape this guy inside you. When you let that go, your life gets happier. And it gets happier for a real simple reason, and that is you actually do love the people that you're bullying. Unless you're a sociopath, which I wasn't, just a jerk, not a sociopath. You really feel for them. And so you are torn when that child cries because you slapped them. You were torn when your wife is in despair because you've just picked another fight with her that you know and she knows is a
Right.
lie, because you're not fighting about what you're fighting about.
No.
You're fighting to dominate. And the burden is heaviest on the person doing that, not on the recipient, because the recipient is in the right. The person doing it knows they're in the wrong. And unless they're a sociopath, they know that and they carry it with
Yeah.
them. And they either have a choice, you change, or you go further down that path and you wind up being a Donald Trump, and you wind up being a Bolsonaro, you wind up being the Ayatollah. And then, of course, you're dead inside.
Well, the book is Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, by Frank Schaeffer. And it comes out November 2nd, which is a Tuesday. And I only know that because books come out on Tuesdays, friends. Movies come out on Fridays. Books come out on Tuesdays. So Tuesday's November 2nd. And Frank, you probably didn't pick that date because very few authors get to pick the date
Nope.
of their publication, but that is also going to be an election day, for some elections in the United States. This is in 2021. And then the first Tuesday of November in 2022. Wouldn't it be great if we all had a politics that was built around these same ideas? Love, children, stability, planet, happiness. Wouldn't that be a great life platform and political platform? Well, Frank Schaeffer makes that possible, people. Frankie, thank you, buddy.
Hey, thank you for taking the time. It really means a lot to me. And I will see you out there on the road again.
We're going to do it. Hey, and thanks to all of you for all your great comments. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Really great ones from all the chats. So thanks for being a part of it all. And Frank, we'll see you down the road, and all the rest of you, we'll